Hello, I'm military genealogist Simon Pearce, and in this video, we're going to take a closer look at one of my favourite First World War collections, the British Army Medal Index cards. I'm going to tell you all about the collection and, importantly, how it can help you with your research. So get yourself comfortable and join me as we take a closer look at this fantastic First World War collection. You may be asking the question, what is a medal card? Well, the medal cards provide an indication of the medals your ancestor was entitled to during the First World War for their service overseas with the British Army. They were created towards the end of the war by the Army Medal Office, and it's great to be able to see the different medals that our ancestors were entitled to, because it really starts to bring to life their service. But the cards also contain really useful pieces of information for us as family historians and military genealogists. So the kind of information you might find is your ancestor's name, the units they served with overseas, their ranks, and their numbers. And sometimes the cards contain extra information, like the first theatre of war they served with overseas, the date they entered it, and sometimes their discharge date, the date they were placed on the reserve, or even when they were killed in action. And sometimes, just sometimes, the second part of the card contains address details. Now, I'm going to go into more detail shortly on how to use the cards and the kind of information you'll encounter. But next, I want to show you how you can find the Medal Index card collection on Forces War Records. So where do you find the medal index cards on the Forces War Records website? Well, when you're on our website, if you navigate to the browse bar at the top, you can browse all of our different collections, known as publications. And in this field here, you can start to enter the collection name. So in this instance, we want medal index cards. When the collection appears, if you click the eye, it'll bring the collection up and it'll give you a little bit of information. And when you click continue reading, you'll get a more detailed description of the collection. This is the kind of thing that can give you a little bit more insight of what you might find and some context behind the collection. In terms of searching it, you can use this bar here. Now, you may only know a name, so you can search with name only, but bear in mind this may give you a lot of results given how many cards there are in this collection. You may be able to narrow it down with your ancestors' army number or even their regiment if you know this information, and that will certainly help. But I appreciate that for everyone's at different levels. You know, some of us know this information and others don't. If you're researching someone with quite a unique name, that might be to your advantage. But if you're looking for someone you know served with the Hampshire regiments or the Royal Artillery, but they have quite a common name and you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 entries, you may have to carry out a process of elimination. Try and narrow out and rule out some of these individuals, reference them in other cards, research them in other collections. That's the kind of thing you may have to do. So to start off with, let's start with my great-great-grandfather. We'll enter his name here. Now, I know the details about his service. So when we see here, we have 3 entries and there's an index on the right hand side with a little bit of information just to tell us what's inside the card. Now I know it's this entry here because I've done a little bit of research into him already. We'll click into the card and there it is in front of us. And in the next section, I'm going to give you some tips on how to interpret the cards and the kind of information they can tell you. So let's dive back into the medal cards and we'll start with the medal card of my great-great-grandfather, Bertram Thornton. Now, this type of card is probably going to be one of the most common that you'll encounter during your research, but there are different variations and I'll touch on those later. But why are these cards so important then? Well, in the top left-hand corner, we can see my great-great-grandfather's name. That's going to help me to narrow him down in the collection. As we move across, we can see his corps. So we see that he served with the Army Service Corps and his rank was a private, and we have his number on the right-hand side. And he later served with the Labour Corps too. Now, this is the kind of information that's really going to help me to learn about his military service. These are the units that he served with overseas, and we can use this information, and I have used this information to find him in other collections, like pension records and service records. And you can do the same when researching your ancestors, whether it's a pension record, a casualty collection, or a prisoner of war record. This information is so useful. And as we scroll down the card, we can see in the middle the different medals that my great-great-grandfather was entitled to. He was entitled to the Victory Medal, the British War Medal, and the 1914 to 15 star, not to be confused with the 1914 star, which we'll touch on later. At the bottom of the card, we can see the first theatre of war that he entered. This is number 1, and this equates to France. And there are different codings that relate to the different theatres of war, and you may have to look these up online. And we can see that he entered on the 31st of October 1915. So I've got a really good picture of his service here from this card. But this doesn't end, my research doesn't end with this record. It's one piece of the puzzle. As I mentioned earlier, I would use this to now go and research my great-great-grandfather in other collections. So use this information, take a look at it, make a note, and use it to search other collections too, because you're going to find that it's really, really helpful. But what are the other types of cards that you can encounter? Well, here's one for my great-great-uncle. And you can see here that again, we have the name and the unit information, the basic details at the top, in addition to his 1915 star reference. And if you're wondering what these little coding and shorthand mean here, these are references to the medal rolls that do contain extra information as well. Quite often they might indicate a battalion or unit. We can see in the remarks that actually my great-great-uncle was killed in action and he was in Gallipoli on the 28th of June 1915. So this is an extra snippet of information that's really useful. And this is particularly helpful because if you can't find your ancestor in the service records, around about 60% were destroyed or badly damaged during the Second World War, you're going to need records like the medal cards to help fill in the gaps. So this is already helping to give me some more information. And I can see that he entered the Asiatic on the 23rd of September 1914. So he entered Qingdao in China on this date. So I'm getting some extra information from this card. It's so useful. But as we move into other collections too, you may encounter ones like this. So this is for the 1914 star. So these are for members of the British Army that entered France and the Western Front very, very early on. Some of the first troops to enter in France and the Western Front in the First World War. And we can see that the medal details are at the top here, so that the card looks slightly different. You have a reference here to his qualifying dates, the date he went overseas, the 12th of August 1914, so really early on in the war, and a reference here to clasp and roses, and these were the clasp that he would have worn on the medal ribbon to show the date that he entered very early on in the First World War, and the roses that were also worn on the ribbons. These are indicators of those that were under fire, and there's a certain qualifying period, but these men were under fire very, very early on in the war and took part in the early battles. So this is a really good indication of the earliness, if you like, of their entry into the war. You may also encounter lots of shorthand and coding, some of which the meaning has been lost over time. But there's lots that you can decipher too. And as we move through the cards, we see one for the 19 to 14 to 15 stars, so a little bit extra information here, like the DCM, if your ancestor was entitled to a gallantry award, it may be noted here, so the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Again, the references to the theatre of war they entered. And as we look at other cards too, this is for an officer. Now, officers had to apply for their medals, the medals of other ranks, so for privates, lance corporals, sergeants, etc. They were sent to them or their next of kin, but officers had to apply. And you'll see extra bits of information here, and maybe even on the next page, an address and lots of extra notes. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at officers' records. You may see this extra information on the bottom. What other things might you encounter in the records? Well, you may encounter a reference to the SWB list, the Silver War Badge. This was a badge issued to anyone who was discharged honorably from the army, maybe due to wounds or sickness, and this will help you look them up in the Silver War Badge collection. We have that on Forces War Records. You may find a card specifically dedicated to the Silver War Badge. This soldier here, Albert Taylor, you have his number, his rank, his regiment, but you also have the date of discharge and enlistment, which is a really nice extra bit of information on these Silver War Badge cards here. And it even provides the details, discharged under paragraph 392 XBI of the King's regulations due to sickness. So these are the different types of cards that you might encounter within the collection. Now, I'm going to go over some anomalies next and some other bits that you might encounter when you're researching the medal index cards. Let's have a look at some other considerations when searching the collection. Now, whilst many soldiers will be recorded under their full name, you may have an ancestor who's recorded under their initials, maybe one or two initials. So just bear this in mind when you're searching. So in the past, when I've been looking for Geoffrey Oliver, I found him under G. Oliver. And here he is in the collection. Now, it's worth bearing in mind as well that when we look at the many notes on this card for Geoffrey, you may come across the phrase com, or which means commissioned. So he was commissioned as an officer on the 8th of October 1915. So a nice extra bit of information there. Do bear in mind as well that your ancestor may have multiple entries in the collection. So my great-great-uncle, who was killed at Gallipoli, I can see that he has a card here detailing his Victory Medal and his British War Medal. There's also a card for his 1914 to 15 star. Now, this should appear on one card altogether, but I can see it's because they've spelt his surname Chessman. And a way around that is to search using wildcards or an asterisk, which will you can replace the letter with an asterisk and it will search for multiple variations. So I searched for CHEMAN and his number 10441. And I have the two variations here. So just bear that in mind. Use an asterisk, a wildcard, in place of certain letters if you think your ancestor's surname is spelled in different ways. Another thing to mention is that this collection largely relates to the British Army, but there are other units that do make their way into this collection. You may find the occasional reference to someone that served with the Red Cross. They may not have been awarded medals, sometimes they applied and a card was created, or you may even find references to those serving with the nursing service, like the Queen Alexander's Imperial Military Nursing Service. So just bear this in mind, it's always worth searching, although the collection does largely relate to the British Army. So that's a guide, an intro and a guide to the British Army Medal Index cards for the First World War. I hope you have fun using the collection. Good luck with your research and stay tuned for more collection deep dives in the future.